really excited to have Alison Carter here. We're excited to have her in the department, but we're also excited to have her here to give a talk. As you know, she's a visiting professor. I can't believe I had to read that off the sheet. She's a visiting assistant professor in the department right now. She's also, and this is where I needed to read because her list of amazing feats and accomplishments is quite long. She's also an honorary fellow in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's an honorary associate in the Department of Archaeology at the University of Sydney. She completed her PhD in anthropology at Wisconsin-Madison in 2013, and she carries both an MSc from that institution and a BA in religion and archaeological studies from Oberlin College. Her research primarily focuses on the political economy and evolution of complex societies in Southeast Asia, but she has side interests in some really cool stuff, including trade, craft technology, religion, and household archaeology, which I think is just the bee's knees. She has a long history of working in Southeast Asia and has co-directed and completed research at sites such as Kop Panov, Phnom Sophie. Did I say that?
Yes,
Okay.
Phnom Sophie. Yeah.
Sophie.
Lovia.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Lovia, which is a very easy thing to pronounce, so I apologize. And Ben Watts. So here's where it gets really cool. She is an enormously prolific researcher from all kinds of perspectives. She's carrying at the moment both a Dumbarton Oaks project grant and a National Geographic Society exploration grant for research at Angkor Wat, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. And in a 5-year period, she's published 11 articles and chapters in this research, as well as edited 3 books. So she's here to talk to us today about Angkorian residences.
Thank you so much.
Alison.
I feel like you made me sound a lot smarter than I really am. Thank you for that. I'm going to turn the lights off if that's okay. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm excited to talk about my research today. This is fieldwork that I was just doing last summer in June and July. There's still a lot of questions. I don't have that many answers yet, a lot of questions still. I'm working on the Angkorian period, the Angkorian civilization of Cambodia, which if most people are familiar with the archaeology of Cambodia, they would be familiar with the Temple of Angkor Wat, which is extremely photogenic. We say it's the largest religious monument in the world. I'm not exactly sure what that means. It's a huge structure, a huge complex. It appears on the flag of Cambodia. Many other people are familiar with Cambodia through Angelina Jolie and the Lara Croft Tomb Raider movie. She's filming a film right now on the Khmer Rouge period, filling my Facebook feed with pictures of her filming all around Cambodia. Of course, many people know about Cambodia from the Khmer Rouge period. The entire extent of the empire, we think about the area of influence and perhaps areas that it might have controlled at its height, covered most of mainland Southeast Asia. So the influence of the Angkorian civilization really spread far and wide, although the main areas of impact were around here, the urban heartland of Angkor near the Tonle Sap Lake in Cambodia, and I have another map here. So most of the Angkorian Empire was centered on the modern nation of Cambodia, with the urban heartland being here. You can see Cambodia as a flat landscape of about 100 meters above sea level. And the seasonality in Cambodia and Southeast Asia more generally is really important for thinking about civilizations here. Part of the year gets not enough rain, part of the year gets too much rain, and so managing water and the flooding of the rivers and the lake itself, the Tonle Sap Lake, is a really important part of life in Cambodia now. Was life important for life in the Angkorian period and important for early civilizations that were growing up in Southeast Asia as well too. This is a more zoomed in map of the Tonle Sap Lake, so you can see this dark area is kind of the extent of the lake during the dry season, and then during the rainy season, the wet season, this lighter blue area is the extent of the floodplain, and the urban heartland of Angkor is right here near the modern town of Siem Reap, right on the edge of the floodplain. So it's depositing as it's flooding really rich agricultural land, which is great for farming rice. And the Tonle Sap Lake itself is one of the world's largest inland fisheries, so it's a really major source of protein for people in the region too. If you heard Mitch Hendrickson a couple weeks ago, he's talked about a lot of this also. So it's a great place to have an empire if you want to have one. So the Angkorian Empire, based on historic documents, runs from 802 to 1431 CE. Although we know that there were people in mainland Southeast Asia for tens of thousands of years before that, and there were rice farmers starting around 2500 BCE. And we see this long trajectory leading up to the Angkorian Empire. My dissertation research was on the Iron Age, sometimes called the early historic period, where we really see a lot of the kind of foundations for the later Angkorian Empire emerging. But what I'm going to talk about today is really this later period. Most of the scholarly work on Angkor was done in the early 20th centuries, or it was really started in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by the French colonial rulers in the region. They were really especially focused on first creating an inventory of sites, then starting to do reconstruction of many of the temples that were in pretty poor condition. And then from there, most of the research on Angkor really focused on the temples themselves, their inscriptions, which were usually on door jambs or stela that were erected in and around temples, the art on the temples, the temple architectural styles. It was really very focused on these elite constructions. And through this work, we've gotten a pretty good history, a culture history of the Angkorian Empire. So this chart is from a tourist guidebook of Angkor, and it basically is just telling you like which kings were ruling at what time and then what temples did they build. So we have this pretty good documentary record. On some of the temples, they actually depict some historical sequences, so we know a little bit about conflicts in the region and interaction between some of the Angkorian rulers and some of the neighboring kingdoms as well too. But we really don't know that much about the broader landscape around the temples until very recently. So this is from a publication in 1979 by a French archaeologist named Bernard-Philippe Grolier. He was one of the first archaeologists in Cambodia to start thinking outside the temples and think about the landscape around Angkor. And so if you go as a tourist now, this is where you spend most of your time, where all the temples are, most of the major temples at least. And then there's little dots around the landscape that represent smaller temple sites or mounds, other areas of Angkorian habitation. And this is the extent of what we knew about the Angkorian Empire really in 1979 or the late 70s during the Khmer Rouge period. So Bernard-Philippe Grolier left in the mid-70s. He was one of the last foreign archaeologists to leave. During the period of the Khmer Rouge period and then the subsequent Vietnamese occupation, most of the Cambodian archaeologists in the country died. Only 3 Cambodian archaeologists in Cambodia survived the Khmer Rouge period. So by the early 1990s, when we had the Paris Peace Accords and there started to become democratic elections, there was a lot of work that needed to be done just internally inside the country and building up human resources to start studying this landscape. And basically archaeology had been put on hold from this time of the 1970s until about the mid-1990s. Since the 1990s, there has been a great proliferation of anthropological archaeological research, and we've really benefited from a lot of the new kind of scientific techniques. So from this map of Angkor, this is the current map of the Angkorian landscape that we know now, based on satellite images and new aerial photographic technology, LiDAR data. So this map was done by my colleagues Damien Evans and Christophe Potier. They've outlined this 1,000 square kilometer area of a low density urban settlement where we have this kind of central area with temples, but then surrounded by all of these little dots in the landscape, which are house mounds, small temples, water management, small ponds and reservoirs. There's canals and dikes and road networks as well too, and Mitch talked a little bit about some of this a couple weeks ago. So this has really expanded, of course, our understanding of what the empire was like. We know that there were perhaps up to 1 million people living here, if we can make a population estimate. And many of these people would have been non-elites, would have been commoners. But because of most of the focus of archaeology and scholarly research has been on temples, we really don't have a very good idea about non-elite people in this landscape. So this is part of my interest. I really want to know more about the daily lives of people, of the non-elite people. And we have just a glimpse of this from the historic and archaeological records. There was a Chinese visitor to Angkor in 1296 who wrote about Cambodia, this Chinese visitor, Zhou Duc-Wan, and he talked about all parts of life in Cambodia, including the people, and for my research interest, he talked about the houses And he said that houses of common people generally were made with thatch roofs, while elite people had bigger houses made with roof tiles, so they were much more substantial constructions, and he associated size with status. And in some cases, he said that there would be slaves associated with houses, and they might be living underneath the houses themselves, so the houses were built on piles. We have a little bit of a glimpse of this wooden architecture on some bas-reliefs from some temples. So one of the major state temples called the Bayon has many depictions of daily life, and so we can see here, these are people, they're supposed to be checking each other for lice, I believe. This is a dogfight there. And you can see some of the architecture around them. So we have a little bit of an idea about what the daily lives were like of people, these little glimpses, and some depictions of the architecture too. Archaeologically, there's been a bit of research also. So the Siem Reap Airport has been expanding, and there's a French-Cambodian team, cultural resource management team that's been going and doing work in the area where they're expanding their runways. And in the process of doing this, they found a small cluster of houses, perhaps a small village and a small temple. And then another French colleague, Jacques Gaucher, has spent the better part of 20 years within the walled city of Angkorian here, doing boots-on-the-ground machete survey, and has created this map of Angkorian, showing this is the royal palace area here, and then all of these other, this grid system is supposed to be all other occupation areas, mounds, where people would have been living inside the walls of the temple. Although, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think he's done any excavation, he's just done survey. So we know generally where people were living. We have little pieces of what their lives might have been like. But I was really interested in investigating this question further. Really, what are the daily lives of people like? Where are they living? How are they living? You know, just answering really basic questions. How are they contributing to this empire? How might have they been resisting some of the changes that were happening? And how can we see change over time and how people are living? So these are really basic questions. When Mitch Hendrickson was here, he was saying that archaeology in this region is in its infancy, and that's very true. I feel like these are questions that in a lot of other parts of the world, especially like the Mayan world, were answered 100 years ago, and we're just catching up. And of course, I feel like in a room full of anthropologists, I don't have to explain why this is important, but I have this in here. If we think of the population really could have been close to 1 million people, most of the people in the society were not elites, and we know virtually nothing about them. So this is really just important to understand. We want to understand Angkor, we should understand all members of society, including the commoners, women, children, people who are not normally studied archaeologically, I suppose, or at least not represented in the temples and written documentation. And one way to go about this is by doing household archaeology, so focusing specifically on where people are living. And households can also be an important way to think about ancient state economies, since we think about, in a lot of these older societies, there's a lot of craft production, and especially for farmers, this was all kind of oriented at the household level. So we can look at these smaller units to try and understand the larger units of the Angkorian Empire. So I've been working with the Greater Angkor Project, which is a collaboration between the University of Sydney and the Apsara Authority in Cambodia, to look at residential patterns. They started this work several years ago, 2010, I believe. And they are they're really interested in looking at residential patterns and also looking at change over time from the Angkorian to the post-Angkorian period. And one of the places where we have been focusing our work is inside temple enclosures. And part of the reason why we've been looking inside temple enclosures is because there's an inscription from Taprum. Taprum is the temple that was in Lara Croft Tomb Raider, so now it's called the Lara Croft Temple. But inside Taprum was an inscription that talked about Taprum as actually being a university. They called it the Rajvihara University. It dates to the late 12th century, and this inscription, which is now in the National Museum in Phnom Penh, this is it pictured here, they described all of the different people affiliated with the temple, and that there were thousands of people somehow affiliated with the temple, that inside the university, students and teachers were living together, which I think is funny, actually, if you can imagine students and teachers living together inside this temple, and that they were, consuming this huge amount of rice, which some scholars have estimated could support like up to close to 30,000 people. So this is one particular state temple within a landscape of many, many temples, and we know that it had many hundreds of people affiliated with it, and perhaps many people living inside the enclosure. So this was partly why we were starting by looking at inside temple enclosures, as based on this inscription. And this is a great idea, except that many of the temples and the areas around the temples where people might have been living are very heavily forested. So this is a Google Earth map of Toprom. The temple, you can sort of see the outline of the temple itself here, underneath the trees. This is the enclosure wall around the temple. So in theory, there would have been a lot of people living here, but it's super difficult to see that. And the same problem exists for Angkor Thom. So this image I showed you earlier of this map, this is what Angkor Thom looks like on Google Earth, also heavily forested. Just this little person I always think of this as like a robot. It's not a robot, it's a water feature. It looks like a robot to me. This little robot-shaped feature here. So this is 20 years of trying to fight through this tree cover, right? And that's not necessarily realistic for every archaeologist if you want to try and understand where people are living. So fortunately, we can benefit from new technology, which to me is magical. And so we have this new LiDAR technology, light detection and ranging, which is airborne laser scanning. And basically what we do is we have a helicopter, strap this LiDAR device on the helicopter, fly it over where you want to survey, and it shoots these lasers out, which bounces off the ground and then returns, and the machine is measuring the return, and it bounces off trees, it bounces off leaves. But because the lasers are so small and they're coming out of the machine so quickly, they can go through the gaps in the tree leaves and hit the ground surface as well too. So when you get your LiDAR data back, this is what it looks like. But people have been working with LiDAR data for a while. They have a pretty good idea about what the tree signatures are, so we can peel the tree signatures off and then just see what the ground surface underneath the trees looks like. So there was a major LiDAR survey done in 2012 over the central Angkor region, and this is one of the results. So this is the LiDAR image of Angkor Thom compared to 20 years of survey on the ground, and you can see it's really similar. And this took a few minutes of LiDAR survey plus a few days of processing the data. So it's pretty revolutionary technology. And because it matches so closely, I think, we have to thank Jacques Gaucher for doing all this work in advance, the ground truthing, to tell us that this actually works quite well. But now you can see, like, the interior of Angkor Thom really does have all of this kind of grid system with these little dark spots, which would be little ponds, and then mounds next to them where people would have been living. So this has been great. We looked at a few temple sites, and I've been spending most of my time at Angkor Wat. So this is Angkor Thom, the big walled city that I just showed you here. Angkor Wat is down here. And of course, it's really beautiful. It's this huge temple here. Part of you enter from the west side, so part of the western entrance is open and not filled with trees, but the remaining area of the enclosure is covered with trees. It was constructed in the early 12th century by this king, Suryavarman II. And this is what it looks like. So this area is open, but you can see the rest of it is pretty densely forested. But we get our LiDAR data, we can peel this tree layer off, and now we can see this ground surface underneath. And it's really cool. And I mean, it's amazing to me every time I look at this. So we have this very nicely arranged, I don't know, like waffle-looking area around the temple with these mounds and then depressions next to them, which we keep calling ponds. I'll talk about that in a second. Nice orthogonally arranged grid system here. This area of the temple has been pretty heavily modified, especially since the colonial period. So we think that this grid system that we can see clearly on the eastern side of the temple extended into the western side as well too. It extends over here. I'll show you an image about that in a second. And then we have these super interesting square spirals down here to the south of the moat of Angkor Wat. And I'll talk about this in a little bit more too, but this is super, I know we were all really surprised when we saw this. It's just so unusual. It looks like a maze that would be at the Palace of Versailles or something. Totally unexpected, and when you're on the ground in this area, which is also heavily forested now, you cannot clearly see what this pattern is. You can see kind of mounds and depressions, but this was a big surprise to us, how extensively planned this landscape was. So here's another kind of top-down image. You can see a little bit more clearly these mounds and depressions. Hopefully you can also see there's these linear features that are running through, which we think were roads or paths, kind of orienting the mounds on this grid network. And then we have this external enclosure on the other side of the moat that seems to be lined up with the Angkor Wat internal grid system and surrounded by some kind of earthen embankment and ditch as well too. So what we did in 2013, I should show you. This is, this is an artist reconstruction, kind of a hypothesis that we're testing right now. If all of these mounds had houses on them, and they really did look like this nice suburban with their ponds next to them, and if each mound had some kind of family on it, we could say perhaps that the interior of this temple enclosure could have had almost 3,000 people, if we're going to estimate population. We don't know that all of these were occupation mounds. We don't know that they were all occupied at the same time, but this is something that we're trying to test earlier. Plus, it's a cool image. In 2010, I was not part of the 2010 season at the Greater Angkor Project. There was a small pilot study there in 2010 before we had LiDAR data, just testing out if they thought this was occupation area, and they actually ended up finding a lot of remains from the French colonial modifications that they had made to the landscape too. So these little green boxes, these are not to scale, by the way, but little green boxes were where they had done a few test trenches in 2010. We went back in 2013 armed with our LiDAR data, and because especially the southeastern quadrant of the enclosure was so well preserved, we really focused our research on this area. So we really did want to get at this idea that these mounds were occupation areas. So what we did was put in a bunch of 1x2 trenches. Again, these are not to scale. 1x2 trenches in a bunch of locations in this area, and then we are also testing the external enclosure over here too, to see if we could find evidence for occupation. And we did. We found quite a few pieces of evidence. So this is from one of our trenches where we had a dump from a seemingly kitchen context. This is a traditional water jar here. There was a bunch of charcoal and cooking pots, broken cooking pots here. We also found a bunch of stones that seemingly were part of the house construction in the landscape as well too. And some of the stones seem to have been decorated, broken decorations, so we associated that with being roughly contemporaneous with the construction of the Angkor Wat temple, and that they were recycling some of these sandstone pieces into perhaps the house construction around the temple. Oh, so this is a broken piece that's probably from a window decoration there. We found a lot of ceramics. Most of them were earthenware, which we associate with cooking and storage, and some other Cambodian stonewares that are glazed, and then quite a few Chinese tradewares too. Overall, it really just seemed like an assemblage, a ceramic assemblage that we associated with occupation. So we felt pretty confident that there was occupation. Based on the ceramic data, we could say that the occupation was roughly organized around the construction of the temple, but dating all the way into the 17th century, so into the post-Angkorian period as well too, which is pretty interesting. And then we recently got radiocarbon dates that fairly confirmed this, that most of it was, some of this predating a little bit of what we know of when the temple constructed, and then associated with when we know the temple was being used, and then all the way into the post-Angkorian period. Which is supposedly when Angkor is collapsing and most people are leaving this landscape. But some people are sticking around and still using Angkor Wat, which wasn't totally surprising to us, because on the actual temple itself, we have a lot of information that people kept returning to this location after the collapse of the Angkorian Empire. So in the 16th century, we have a king who returned to finish carving bas-reliefs. There's 17th century Japanese map of Angkor. It's a major pilgrimage center, so people were coming from all over Asia. In the 18th century, there was a local provincial governor that built a stupa and put an inscription inside one of the galleries and buried his family there. And then all the way leading up to when the French came into Angkor, people were still returning to this temple over and over again. What's interesting is that they're still using the landscape seemingly around the temple as well too. Okay, so we did a bunch of 1x2 trenches. I really wanted to go back and intensively excavate one particular mound to see if we could get a lot more information about the households and what people are doing. So in June and July, I got funding from National Geographic and Dumbarton Oaks, and we went back to one of the mounds where we had done one test excavation before and expanded our trenches. And there were three hypotheses that I was testing. First was that confirming this idea that these were occupation areas, which we felt pretty confident about from our preliminary excavations, but I really wanted to get more solid information on this, see if we could kind of fill out this image we have a little bit more, see if we could find better, see if we could find basically what the house form looked like. Confirm this idea that they were being built or lived in by non-elite people. So following Sodekwan's description that we were not finding roof tiles, that the houses would be fairly small, that they were probably made out of organic material, and looking at ceramic data to help us understand if they had access to really nice ceramics or not too. We also were investigating this idea about short-term occupation. And we came up with this hypothesis because in our initial test excavation, we were not finding as much garbage as we thought we would, as we expected that for people who would be living there year-round over several centuries. So from texts that are inscriptions that are at smaller temples, so definitely not large state temples, but smaller temples describe a rotating series of these fortnightly work groups of people who would come in on the waxing and the waning of the moon. So we wondered if maybe something like this could be happening, or if there was some seasonality to when people would be living in Angkor, perhaps related to the agricultural cycle and different ritual cycles. So this was a question that we wanted to investigate more also. So coming back to this map, so I'm going to zoom in. We were on this mound. We get a little bit closer. So this, you can see our little grid system. My colleague, PhD candidate at the University of Hawaii, a Cambodian PhD candidate named Paul Heng, came up with this grid system of 4 mounds and 4 ponds. This seems to be the grid system that's being repeated inside the temple. So we were on this mound here. And I came back to this mound because it wasn't as covered with trees as other mounds. It seemed like it would be a lot easier to excavate, although we still had to work around termite hills and trees in doing our trenches. So this purple square is where we had excavated in 2013, and then we came back, and all of these black boxes are where we excavated in June and July of 2015. And we put one trench in this pond as well too, or the depression. And this, I'm going to show you mostly pictures from this is where we were finding most of our stuff, in this big trench there. And this is what we found. We were finding, and I don't know what to make of this. I'm happy to entertain any ideas that you guys have. We're finding a lot of recycled sandstone. So we think these are all big pieces of sandstone that we think are cast-offs from construction of the temple, Angkor Wat Temple. And some of them are laid perfectly flat, like they might have been some kind of path or floor. And I mean, we were working in the rainy season. If you are just walking on the surface, it gets really sticky and muddy. So having a stone path or having an area under your house or around your house with stone would really make things a lot easier. But then some of them weren't as nicely placed. Like we had this giant piece that was kind of like askew. So I'm still a bit baffled about how to interpret all of these stones. Here's another sideways image of it. We did find these possible post holes. So I had really hoped that I could find a really clear outline of a house and what a house looked like. That was perhaps a pipe dream, given the soil conditions and the extensive bioturbation from termites and tree roots and things. But we did find some possible post holes that seemed to be making some kind of pattern. Interestingly, if this really is some kind of post hole related to some architectural construction, it's not orthogonally arranged, which would be fairly unusual considering everything else inside this enclosure is arranged north, south, east, west. But we have these stones here, and then this particular area is interesting because we had some brick and then we had fired clay.